Hello everyone. We are glad to have you all here today. On behalf of our team, I extend a very warm welcome to all of you to the 8th and final day of the Kurla Valki Design Forum 2020. My name is Shreya.
And my name is Riddhi, and we'll be your host for today's session. It has been an intense week with several revelations and thought-provoking ideas that were brought to light and discussed in the forum this year. So to conclude the forum and preside over the culmination discussion, we have Professor Chhaya, who has been with us throughout this journey. Thank you for joining us today.
We'll start today's session with a note by Professor Chhaya on this. Request the panelists and moderators to join the discussion later and share their thoughts with us. The discussion would then be open to the audience. So without much further ado, let's begin the session.
Morning, everyone. It's really been hard work all these days, but it's been very, very enjoyable, very edifying, lots to learn. And I thought first I would do this in 3 parts. I'll first make a very brief summary of what happened during the 7 days previous to this. And then I will give my perception of what happened. And then I will raise a few questions. And after that, the discussion will be between the moderators and the panelists and the student panelists as well. And then we will open it up to anybody who wants to ask questions. Let's see how it goes. So we have, on the first day, there was a very interesting conversation between Vivekananda and Balkrishna Doshi. What struck me was the kind of things that they talked about, especially the tremendous ethical commitment to the notion of practice, to the notion of teaching, and to the very notion of being human that was reflected in this conversation. It was a wonderful introduction to Varki the man and Varki the architect as well, Varki the teacher. And the forum rotates around this name. So it was very good to get that. Also, there was the documentary made by the students, which was shown, which I think was in a short time, very well put together. So that's what happened on the first day. And then we had 3 days of student projects interspersed with 3 days of conversations between 2 of the panelists. So on the first day, we had time and memory. So the overall theme of conflict. So here it is the conflict between time and memory, where Gurmeet Rai and Arindam Datta, both of them important figures in that area of work that each of them has excelled in, discussed the notion of time and memory in relation to the students' work. Of course, other people were present, and there was, Riaz was moderating that. After that, there was a discussion between Gurmeet and Arindam, which also was extremely interesting from the point of view of the way in which they look at their own spheres of work and reality of the world as a whole. The next session was the conflict between humans and humans, where Gautam Bhan and Sarosh Ankleshwariya were the main panelists, and uh, uh, Shubhra was the moderator, and there was a wonderful discussion about the student projects, followed on the day that next day, the discussion between Gautam Bhan and Sarosh Ankleshwariya. And the next series was the conflict between humans and nature. And the main discussants were Robert Powell from Singapore or Malaysia, and Kunjan Garg from Kerala. And this discussion also, it was moderated by Uday Andhare, and it was a discussion about 5 projects in relation to the idea of human beings and the relation to the world of non-human reality. And then there was, the next day, there was a dialogue between Robert and Kunjan, which also brought out many, many interesting points. Now, if I look at the whole event, and the panelists will pardon me for doing this, I'm doing a bit of a summarization, which you may not all agree with. But I thought that the 2 days, the first day and the last day, on the first day, Varkey, and on the last day, Robert Powell, bracketed the conversations in between. I'll tell you how I mean this. I mean, there was a generation which took a modest view of the work of the architect as a workmanlike ethical service, and took it seriously in terms of the knowledge, in terms of the skills, and in terms of the relationships that this asked for. And I was looking at Robert's presentation about urbanity and domesticity, which in that generation, those were the 2 major issues. I'm not trying to say that Robert belongs to an earlier generation, but clearly there is a distinct flavor difference between his and Varkey's discussions of architecture and the discussions that were in between. The 6 other discussions talked about architecture, but their emphasis or their focus was more on power relations and what they do to architecture and society at large. And between the late modernist and the postmodern view of existence, I thought there is a very, very interesting bracketing here. Maybe the 2 approaches need to pick up threads one from the other. Maybe if Varkey was alive today, and as Robert is practicing, some of the, I could sense some of the questions of this emphasis on power relations beginning to surface in the work of that generation, and the question of the ethical values beginning to surface in the younger people's discussions. But I think this could go much farther. And we'll leave it at that. And we will proceed to how I looked at what happened on the 7 days. The panelists will, of course, have a chance to rebut my claims here. However, it's something that I quite enjoyed doing in terms of categorization. Of course, it's always an oversimplification. And needs to be taken with a pinch of salt. Yeah. If I looked at all the projects that were presented, 15 projects, and all the discussion that took place, I think there was a sense that there is a bewildering complexity to the world. The world is so complex that it is difficult to gain purchase on how to work within it. This is a question both for the school or academia, how they will run the program of education. It is a question to the practitioner. It is a question to the student equally. In this bewildering complexity of the world, how do I work? And this, I think, could take two forms. And it seemed to me that in the majority of the projects, not all, but in the majority of the projects, there was a certain distancing in order to achieve a sort of clarity. That you stood apart from reality, or you stood outside of it, and you looked at it as something which was an object which could be taken apart. And then thought was the weapon to achieve clarity. Thought proceeded in a manner in which it needed to itemize the questions. And this led to the project. And I use that word very carefully, that in schools of architecture, you are expected to end up with a project, which is a definable, problematized manner of showing your skills as an architect, especially in the final year project. So on one side, that is the approach, possible approach. And it seems that most schools and most students, and perhaps most teachers, most practitioners, are in favor of this approach. But there could be another approach, which I quote James Joyce in the portrait of the artist as a young man, when he says, "Welcome, O life. Welcome, O life. I go to encounter for the millionth time the reality of experience, and to forge in the smithy of my soul, the uncreated conscience of my race." The uncreated conscience of my race. So that the subject of study, in Joyce's terms, is something which is a plunging into reality, in-depth immersion in reality with little hope for clarity. But the possibility of a muscularity of ethical norm. Because swimming, when you plunge into the water, swimming is a mutual activity. The water works on you and you work on the water. And it is not something which is standing outside, but which is the whole body is immersed within the water in reality. And through that, a kind of musculature is developing, a kind of bone structure is developing, a kind of movement is developing. And that could be the other direction. Some students had an inkling of that. They were deeply moved by the circumstances of their project. And I think that was a very interesting thing. So instead of a project, what comes about is a direction. In the first case, you define the project. In the second case, you insinuate a direction of thought, a direction of action, knowing that no action will be complete and will require to be modified from time to time as it goes on. But the project requires exclusion and therefore will always be framed as conflict. Do I privilege nature or do I privilege humans? Do I privilege memory or do I privilege future? Do I privilege this human or that human? Will be seen as a conflict in the project. But in the direction, there is the unavoidable, the inevitable inclusion. It is not possible to avoid it. And this is something which has been what someone called the peaceful gaze of art. The peaceful gaze of art is something that includes and that cannot find in itself the violence to exclude. And this is something which is possible in the Joycean mode. Lastly, the project is for something. It is for something. And it can be measured and evaluated in terms of whether it fulfills that for. But the swimming into reality and the direction that evolves is done for its intrinsic worth. And the idea of intrinsic worth, I wonder whether it is beginning to disappear from our lives. The intrinsic worth of a human being, the intrinsic worth of a leaf, the intrinsic worth of a piece of stone. And these are questions which demand a quiet persistence rather than a visible. So in the project mode, you have to become visible. And today's media demand a visibility. And I think work is also something which changes as a result of the demand for visibility. Whereas the work in the other mode is a work of quiet persistence. So with that background, I am proposing that we look at the 7 days as a meditation upon what we as architects, what we as teachers, what we as schools, what we as students could go towards. And the question is not either or, because the project is deeply embedded within the purpose or in the direction. But for a while, it seemed to me during these 7 days that that larger direction, that purpose is not so visible to us now. And maybe that has to do with the idea of an ethical commitment or the skepticism towards, and I'll be brutal enough to use the word morality, which is not a very happy term in these times. So then, with that prefatory, rather long preface, I would like to put to the panelists a few questions. I have 3, but of course you are most welcome to comment on what I said as well. So the first question is a question in which I also hope that you will discuss what I have said. So the first question is it a good idea to have conflict as a theme? And I put the question to all the panelists.
How do are we all connected now? Can we?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Mine might seem a bit of a simplistic response to this, but first of all, thank you very much for the invitation to come to this forum. I have enjoyed the experience. It's my first time at KVDF. Interestingly, the invitation to address the conflict between humans and nature prompted me to do a complete review of my own relationship to nature. It took me a week to prepare the lecture that I gave last night, as I tried to put together my thoughts on, I had to assemble drawings, to assemble paintings, to assemble pictures. And it revealed not only my own journey in architecture, which I was asked to do, but it opened up future paths as well. So the question of conflict, I think, was a very good one to put, and to cause me, quite apart from the aims of the forum, it educated the panelists as much as it educated the students. That was an amazing thing I found. It caused me to look at myself in order to address the audience, and reconstructing my life, the goals throughout my life, and assessing my achievements and failures as well. So this, it was also immensely useful to see how other academics and students are progressing. So it really was a learning process, and I think the putting it in the context of conflicts was a very good starting point.
But Robert,
yes.
Did you ever see yourself as fighting nature? You are a human, and was there a conflict between you and nature?
No, I didn't. Actually, I saw myself as almost in worshiping nature.
Mm.
I've always been in awe of nature, I think, rather than a conflict with nature. So no, that again is an interesting question. Did I ever see myself really fighting nature? Not at all. But still, the word conflict did cause me to address that question. On another level, the subjects that the students chose, and earlier in the week I was a little worried about the way that we talked about political space and social space and open-ended solutions, rather than, as you possibly picked out, my practice has always been about solutions and presenting solutions at the end of the day. I always think of architecture in practice. You cannot, you can hypothesize for so long, but eventually you have to come down to a deadline and you have to make a decision. But the way in which the students presented was really interesting. I loved the idea of the question of waste, for example, that one of the students studied in a very poetic way. But it caused me to look at in my kitchen at my 3 or 4 receptacles in which I put glass and steel, glass and metal, and I put another one, I put plastic, another one I put paper, and another one I put my recyclable compost waste, and to examine questions like that. So the questioning part was very, very useful as well. But I come back to it's been such a learning process for me as a panelist, and not just for the individual. So conflict was a good starting point.
Okay. Other panelists.
May I come in because of your question about whether one has ever felt one is fighting nature. And Uday and Shubhra were part of that process where we were sifting through the 180 odd projects that had been put in. And when we looked at those which were actually tending towards the category of, let's say, nature and human and nature conflicts, we all realized that there was a very different sense of what nature meant across the board to the students who had made proposals. And at one point of time, I think we articulated that we come from a very different, even in this one generation, we come from very different experiences of nature in which we locate our responses. So let's say that at the time that I grew up, it was still possible in a particular in a particular distance from the city to experience certain types of nature, life, animals, things like that, that we consider nature. It seemed that the manner in which this had been embodied and experienced by the students making a proposal was from a very different place and from a very different time. And as much as we realized that, that was perhaps a more technologized time, it also meant that there was a certain nostalgia in the way that we were looking back, and the memories and images we were using as nature in order to engage with those projects. And so, I mean, even though, so I mean, the point I'm trying to get to is that the image of and the experience of nature, or the environment that one has internalized, is changing because of the generation to generation change in the way that one has engaged with it, and that is then feeding back into what one proposes as decisions, as responses to that nature. So I just thought that there's that dimension to it as well.
Yeah, Riya used the word nostalgia, um, which gives me a lead to ask Gurmeet whether she feels that there is a conflict between memory and time, or memory and future. And is this a matter of nostalgia? Because the world keeps on changing, and we can frame it either as a conflict between what existed before and what exists now and what might exist in future, or we can frame it in a way in which we say some things ought to remain and some things ought to be changing. And maybe it is no longer a conflict, but it is a flow of a certain kind. But I'm putting words into your mouth, which I don't want to do. So would you like to say something about nostalgia and the conflict, or the so-called conflict, between memory and time?
Actually, I'm a little aversive to the word nostalgia.
Mm.
Because I personally believe that that gets into quite a bit of romanticism. And it kind of, because if I were to look at myself as a practitioner and I put myself in a particular context where I need to respond, nostalgia would mean that I put myself in the center of that particular space. And I think that is problematic for me. So, memory, context, community, a certain understanding of values, attributes of those values, as much as one is dealing within that space of emotion or emotive, one still wants to, I mean, I personally work towards try to be objective towards it. And I consciously bring myself to that I be a, I mean, the fundamental thing is that I should be a good listener. And empathy becomes an important word for me. More than nostalgia, it's empathy that I work with.
So you're saying that you cannot stand outside in order to listen. You're saying that you have to be face to face or in close to the person to whom you are listening to.
Yeah, and it goes in, it's also the person. It will also be like when we said human or human nature, or within this entire realm, the 3 points that you've touched upon in the last 6 days, you know.
Yeah. So I think with that, you've directly thrown it back into the human to human question. And Sarosh may want to say something about that, since he was a panelist in the human-to-human conflict. Do you think that the idea of framing the question in terms of conflict is an idea which will lead to sympathy and warmth, or will it further exacerbate the conflict that evidently exists?
Thank you.
No, I know the question about the needing to what do you call it? Demystify and bring out the truths. Yes, I understand that. But would you say that framing the question in terms of conflict may lead to hardening of positions in the human-human conflict?
Obviously, I mean, your question is rhetorical.
Yes.
Clearly, yes. So that's a short answer to that. Yes, your question is very rhetorical. And absolutely. I mean, for one, I am cynical of binaries for many, many reasons that, I don't think we have the time to go into, but I also understand the need for them in order to clarify certain positions. So much as, all of these categories are needed, they are also very dangerous to sort of anchor entire conversations around. I think they are good as provocations at best. But I want to, if I may, address your point about project versus direction, about view versus swimming, because you constructed it in that way. And it strikes me that absolutely they are entirely different positions, but I almost insist that our training as architects allows us for the capacity for both immersive understandings and abstractions. And I think that's what makes our discipline quite formidable, because we have the capacity to actually abstract things and then to materialize them. And maybe it is a question of what we privilege, what is procedural, what is method. I think that those are absolutely relevant questions, but I wouldn't, again, say one is either better or worse than the other. The other thing that I just want to really quickly touch upon, and it strikes me again while I was looking at all of these projects, I have to absolutely thank the Kurulawarki Forum for inviting me, because it opened my eyes to the questions that students are asking today. And I think that the questions are absolutely quite terrific. I think that they are some of these like kind of existential problems that you can almost never solve, and they are still very much worth addressing. So I feel like we've moved from a time of like questions of identity, style, syntax, grammar, those things have moved a bit to the background, and I see much more of political engagement on questions of ecology and society. And almost all projects seem to tease out these questions. Now, how they are solved, how they're resolved, what are the tools that we bring to the table, how we develop intersectionalities, how we engage with research, how we develop material constructs. These are all very, dense issues to grapple with. But I do think that we have a kind of agency here. And I really did think that the projects, in terms of the ways in which they were constructed as questions, were quite compelling.
So either we can proceed further on this discussion or go to another question. But Shubhra or Uday or Kunjan, would you like to say something to this?
Chhaya, I am reflecting back on your question about was the idea of conflict as a theme a good one or not? And I think this comes through, reflects upon the whole idea of how does one organize something. And it isn't, to begin with, and as Sarosh was right in pointing out that you need some sort of a frame through which a set of ideas could be examined. But I agree in a way that if the notion of conflict was dissolved, and there is a question which Kashi has just brought up.
Yes,
He
yes.
talked about varied perspectives coming out of the idea that the moment there is no splitting up of or compartmentalization of things, could we have been able to sort of discuss the synergies much more freely?
But
And
that it may not be conflict, you see.
It may not
If we are all sitting in the same room with different viewpoints, but agreeing to be in the same room, there is no conflict between us. And the word conflict is a loaded word.
Yes.
And I have raised the question because of that. Yeah.
Yes.
But Kashi's important interjection, I appreciate that. Yeah.
I will keep it brief, but to directly answer the question, but also to sort of in that way tie to what Robert and Gurmeet and Sarosh were saying in a sense as well, that in what I noticed was in starting with the condition of conflict, what was interesting was the theme didn't start and end with conflict. It was response, conflict, response, which means that you're beginning to see a cycle. You're not prerogating conflict over above everything else, which to me was rather interesting. And throughout the course of the week, it seems what that led to was all of us to dwell a little bit more on practice and negotiation, which immediately calls upon and acknowledges something more than you. You can't negotiate with yourself. Well, you can, but in general, you need to be a part of something in order to negotiate and to have, and then of course, Gautam Bhan, etc., who were talking about the rigor of that negotiation versus the empathy required for the negotiations to actually mature into something. And to me, that has been at a personal level, this lockdown and pandemic, I remember ruminating over how easy it was for me to go into lockdown. This idea, we know how to compartmentalize very easily. I knew what I had to do in order to go to a lockdown, how to retreat. The most anxiety-ridden phase for me has been one to emerge out of lockdowns, because it means we are once again negotiating with the world. It calls upon me to be present in those negotiations. They're not abstract anymore. And to me, the whole forum, the way it was framed, provided an opportunity to go back and forth between our proclivities towards compartmentalization and our acknowledgement that we are part of something. So I think in that sense, it has been rather, it has been a moment that has been coming also from where we have been, our legacy, of course, but our immediate experiences. So.
Kunjan, would you like to say something to this?
No, I was thinking along exactly the same lines, and Shubhra said it, which is that it does not end with conflict. The way the theme was articulated as well was about conflict and response, and response, conflict, and response, where we, and again, going back to what Sarosh was saying about, it's not just about abstraction, it's also about materialization. So these are connected ideas as conflicts coming from segregate, but we must segregate, and the moment we do, there is this versus that, and therefore a possibility of a conflict. But the moment you practice, the moment you come back to the material world, it's connected, and that is where there is a possibility of resolution, even if not a resolution, like Shubhra very rightly said, a negotiation.
Yep. It's amazing that the word that stuck was conflict, and the response on the two sides of the word never surfaced sufficiently loud. And it's very interesting how today's world is. And it makes us ask a question about the nature of relationships today. However, I'll go to the next question now, which is a far easier question in one way and a much more difficult question. Over the years, I've noticed that the forum has become a very good place where students display their projects. The projects are seen by people who are in practice and in teaching, and they're discussed with a great deal of seriousness, with great attention paid to the project, which might not have existed even at the time when the project was being examined. And in that sense, it's a wonderful platform. But it's also bothered me somehow that it's the students who always stand in front of us. And we sit back and discuss what they have done. So my question really is, do you think it would be a good idea to have all of us present and the students question us? This I suggested to the student group once and they loved the idea, but then they said, no, we can't do this. So, but I'm asking this wonderful and very, very, important group of panelists. What would you think if we all had to present our work, some selected work, and the students were free to question it in any way they wanted and build a narrative out of it as to what's happening to the profession? Do you think that would be a good idea? Or do you think there should be two forums, put it that way?
So don't you think this already happens to some degree when we present our work?
But see how we have to take it.
No, I know that there is a structural difference.
There's a certain structural difference between the way I look at your presentation or you look at mine and the way we look at the student's presentation. And that if we are talking about the response part of it, the response may be two ways. And how do we increase the students' participation in this process, given the limitations of time, given the limitations of various other things? How do we do that? That's something which is, and one way of doing it is simply turning the whole thing upside down.
May I?
Yes.
Can we take away this idea of defense from presentations? I think then we'll all be...
We have tried this for years and years. Every time the moderator says, this is not a jury, we are here to discuss what is happening in young people's lives, we are here to discuss what is happening in education, we are here to discuss what is happening in profession, etc. But the person who is presenting is so used to the idea of being examined, so that even you and I, when we present, we go back into that same mode of feeling we are being examined. I'm being completely honest about myself. And whether there can be another mode of sharing which doesn't fall into this.
Maybe this has a little to do with the idea of self-reflectivity, where I'm not defending, okay, so again, defense, sorry, but no, where somewhere we sort of recognize that that the self as an idea is not only what we think of it, but it's a collective idea of what everyone thinks of it as well. And this sense of self is always made through these reflections, through interactions, negotiations, again, maybe. And this act of presenting, in that sense, it becomes an act of reflecting, and therefore understanding the work through another eye.
Ideally, yes.
I've sat through many presentations by architects, usually of their own built work. And I can imagine that would be really quite difficult to get a similar sort of presentation by architects, not on their built work, but on their ideas. And what has been interesting about this last 7 days is that it's all unbuilt work, of course. And your panel is very carefully selected from several hundred, I think, projects, 15 projects, which possibly you selected them to promote discussion, and you promoted the best projects to do that. How would you do that for the architects? Could be quite interesting to know to the practitioners to how would they put projects to you, which you would then select for study by the students. It's usually their built work which they present, and can be damn boring at times actually, but and not raise any questions at all. But I think the formula you have at the moment, it causes us as panelists and practitioners to really reflect on our own projects and our own direction in life.
Yeah.
So it works very well. I don't know how you would do it, to be honest, in a complete reversal of the situation.
Maybe you could have a back-to-back, one of student projects and one of practitioners' ideas, not projects. I think you're right. Unbuilt leaves a little freedom of allowing for a certain kindness in discussing something, which the built work is never allowed that kindness, It is always critiqued with great severity. So, but I was wondering whether there could be any other modes also. For example, I was thinking that if some students, more mischievous ones, sat in corners and noted the word being used many times by the same person, and tried to do an analysis of that outlook based on the repetition of certain words. I wonder whether, and I'm curious to know what I would turn out to be if somebody did an analysis of my way of talking. So I think there might be some other underground ways in which the students could do this. And there could be a publication also in quite polite terms about how the panelists also make a society of a kind. But Gurmeet, you wanted to say something and I barged in.
No, actually, I find this conversation quite interesting because in the session, the 5 presentations of students in our session, the Watson Hotel compared very interestingly with the project I've recently done in Amritsar of the Ramba Gate. Now, but I enjoyed all those presentations of the students purely because they were unbuilt. And you had the indulgence, other than various other aspects, to understand what goes into ideation, responding to a context, how the mind of the architect as an artist or as a person who's responding to a context, what is he or she thinking and emoting through that particular, presentation in their work. Now, if I were to compare it to Ramba Gates, if I were to what is my memory of those 4 years that went into creating of that space, which compares in ideas similar to the Watson Hotel, the floor linking up with Kala Ghora Festival and that lovely drawing he had where he where the inside and the outside kind of merged. You know, you had the vendors outside, and then he's looking at some sort of a public space which goes into the ground floor of the Watson Hotel, that seamlessness of space. Now, we try to achieve that in the Rambagh Gate, but my memory of that project is the negotiations with the urban local body, the resistance of the shopkeepers to something. And so once it is the whole act of building, what happens is by the end of it, all this beautiful ideation goes into the background, and you're very here and now, and the negotiation aspects becomes a big drama. And of course, sometimes you can look at it a little objectively, but that's a very difficult one, because you yourself become part of, it's a lot of pain. It's like producing a child, So when you talk about the panelists and the students' projects, it'd be interesting to see what process, if there is a possibility that the students' project is presented the way it is presented, and the panelists who come in actually talk about the process leading to the outcome. And all that got done, and all that morphed into something else, and all that could not be done. And why? And maybe there's a better way of doing it, that the students could respond. Can they kind of jump in and tell you something that you got wrong and could have done differently,
Yeah. So I think this is a wonderful, wonderful idea. And Vishwanath Kashikar, as usual, has put it in a very wise way. He says, instead of reversing, and reversing was the most dramatic way of presenting the idea of Kashi. It was not because I thought reversing is the best thing to do, but it catches people's ears and they start listening. So instead of reversing, let some practitioners and students, and let some students and practitioners be panelists, present the other person, be present. Okay. The other persistent difference is that panelists present their oeuvre complete or theories, whereas students only present one project. So could there be, I'm trying to take what Gurmeet said, sounds like a very, very interesting idea. Could we, for example, say, this project looks something like what Gurmeet might be interested in. And we spend half a day or a day, each panelist with some students, and together they present what they discussed about the unbuilt project and perhaps the built project or an idea project. And we try to find correlations so that it is not presented as a one-off and not presented as something which you stand by alone, but it is something which is part of the kinds of discussions that are going on. And I think, Gurmeet, that's a wonderful idea. I would ask the forum people to consider this as one future thing. And Kashi, you might want to say something more to this.
Just one small thing, the present that I said with the asterisks, that's typically a way of saying I missed that word in the previous comment. So what I meant was, instead of reversing, let it be alternating, that one, like exactly what Gurmeet was saying, let a practitioner present a project and let a student present a project. Another way another idea I had, which I wanted to throw in, was, what if the student presents their journey over the 5 years, presents various selected studios and talks of where they are heading as a practitioner, so that the onus is not on one project, but rather than what are the ideas that all of us are formulating heading towards practice.
So that was, in fact, that goes directly into the third question that I was going to ask.
Can I, before you move to the third one, can I just say something quickly?
Okay.
Go ahead, Sarvesh.
Yeah.
I was just, while Kashi was talking, I was also thinking, it's a question of, Gautam was talking about this as well in our session, a question of how empathy is constructed along with rigor. So we need both. We need rigor on the one hand, and we need empathy on the other. And we've not, the jury format hasn't done a good job of doing that. I do think there is a place for it. Definitely the forum needs another format. But one thought was that, there are one-to-one discussions between students and faculty, however that is constructed. And then the faculty present the students' work. That could be another way of just constructing empathy. I think it's a question of what are the different formats by which we can present the rigor, because so much rigor goes into this work that I would hate to sort of lose it. But at the same time, there has to be a conversation about the empathy that goes into presenting this work. And I've always been struck with how artists in art school get away with the kind of scrap that we would never get away with, as architects, because artists don't have this social burden of putting a project out there. They openly say that, this isn't resolved. I'm struggled with this. There is a certain ease by which they present their work. And then, the reviews are totally different dynamic, at least from the ones that I have seen. And I think it's both good and bad in that we cherish the fact that our work has a certain something that cannot be violated. We get offended if it does, and so on. But at the same time, I think we have to bring in this idea of empathy, which I think is central to also what we do and is not talked about enough.
Great, Shubhra.
Yeah, and I completely, I think it's interesting Sarosh sort of honed in on that one aspect that Gautam was talking about, because I was thinking of exactly the same thing. I was also thinking in terms of, there are a few things. One is, if the one thing I thought that the forum at least acknowledged this time by making the students co-panelists with whatever success was, the manner in which each panelist was introduced, which never happened when it was in person. There was a little bit of an introduction in terms of what the student is about, if we realized. To push it further, on the one hand, it could be a very simple structural thing, which is that on the days of panel discussion, whoever are the panelists also present one project. And therefore, instead of 5 projects, you have 8 projects. And
but
similarly,
Shubhra, it is very difficult for the student group to ask for a certain adherence to the rules of engagement. All the panelists were asked to speak for 20 minutes, but almost all presentations were, I think Kunjan's was the only one which was exactly 20 minutes. Other than that, everybody overshot.
But I think some of these things
could not ring a bell.
But I think some of these things, Chhaya, begin to get worked out in practice, because you have to acknowledge there are habits and implicit biases of disciplines that we are all implicated in. It reminds me, for instance, when Sarosh talked about artists, I work very closely with an organization in Denver with youth. It's a youth arts organization. And from the curriculum to the end of semester presentation, the youth work is always presented alongside the artists who worked with the students equitably, which means it's not like artist work and student work. And in the norm, in the convention of gallery, the artist as well as the students present and are mingling with the audiences equitably. Now, all of the time, it doesn't mean you can guarantee one youth the same amount of time or interest as the artist, but over time, through practice, it begins to create a culture. Yes. And therefore, this is not a silver bullet.
That is exactly why I'm asking this question.
Yeah. And similarly, in
the students who are going to run the forum next time,
Yeah,
probably
exactly.
listening. And I think these are things which we need to bring in rather a nice way into the forum.
And imagine if the
format,
detox,
the
sorry.
format as well as the habits of engagement, I think both these have to be discussed in a little more detail.
Chhaya Sahib, to be taking this a little, shouldn't you be asking this question to the student panelists here as well?
You've bombarded our conversation finally. Good.
We have been listening on, and this is something like I would add from the entire team. Like everyone has been texting us in the background. Like these are things that we always discuss when we sit down in the beginning to think about the forum, because this is something that even our seniors pass on to us, that this format is not fixed and we don't need to continue it. So we had several discussions in the beginning about maybe asking a practitioner to come and present their work. And even there was this another discussion that we had about asking a recently graduated architect from schools across to show their first project and then see, like, put them together and see how a final year project varies from what the first project was. And there was always this conversation, at least not for that we could do all these things, but then we don't want this whole idea of the student forum becoming obsolete in the future, where maybe it gets diluted to an extent that only practitioners come and present then. Because it does happen in many colleges that they have like these lecture series and formats where they only invite practitioners. I think this whole idea of inviting students to present is very, very rare. I don't even think, I have not seen this existing.
Yeah, of course, it's very important. It's
Yeah.
absolutely important, but it's the format. There are two formats. Gurmeet has suggested something which I think is very, very interesting. Kashi also suggested something which also is interesting. There could be other things. For example, if 3 students or 5 students, but perhaps 3, feel a certain solidarity in their work, though their projects are different, and they bring out the main issues that they want to bring forward through their projects. And instead of a single student, there is a group of 3 which is presenting, which always is more comforting than, and there are 3 projects, so that it is not possible for the panelists also to discuss by focusing on one project. And I think this is something which is very, very important. This is also something that needs to be discussed more with the moderators of the discussions, because the moderators need to take a more proactive role in doing this. And I think the forum is a fantastic place, but it could be even more so. And I'm thinking from the point of view of the student. You can see that in the questions, there's one student who has said, I'm a student and I'm made conscious about using various choice of words that I use while presenting, writing, or talking about architecture. Words like traditional, vernacular, public, private, modern, modernity, modernism, and a few more. I sometimes feel so scared as to how to put or engage with such words, and I feel it is stopping me and people around to build meaning or value in such words. It is these words which are conflicting in themselves. It feels like the academic sphere is warning us about the mistakes we might make, rather than discussing such things openly. This forum does that to an extent, but our daily workspace doesn't. What are your views of such circumstances? Is it new to our generation alone, or is it ancestral? I think that's a good question, leading off from the question that the language of conversation and the language and the sort of careful stepping around the pitfalls of language is something which becomes a professional habit. And the student also is learning that tiptoeing stance rather than the stance of walking. And I think this is something where we need to really open up and start discussing uh, in a way in which the gulf between empathy and rigor is not showcased to that extent. Because I think in every empathy, there is a certain rigor. And in every rigor, it will be inhuman if there is no empathy in it. And that every student knows. I have a feeling that every student in doing their project is working from that position. And the forum should really be a way of edifying that position rather than taking it apart. And I hold myself equally guilty of doing the same during the discussions. And I realize on reflecting upon what all happened, that this is something which could move in a somewhat different direction. So through the year, maybe the students who will take over the forum next year should start discussing how it should happen, how it can happen. Can I move to the third question that I had? Is it okay? Or would somebody like to say something?
Just a thought has occurred. We might as well just put it in very, very, very quickly. Is that there's a possibility that that at the beginning, when the student panelists are sort of shortlisted, maybe the panelists sort of send in their profiles as well, and the group sort of self-organizes itself into these empathetic groups. That the student panelists sort of choose their co-panelists, that this is somebody with whom there are common directions for us, and the group sort of self-organize rather than it being like a sort of a voice from above kind of an organization. Just a thought.
I had one point which came up when Gurmeet was speaking, and the idea of professionals and students talking together, and the structural relationship to the topic or the theme for the forum. If I take something like conflict, it's very large and it's outside both the rigor and the empathy of the process. It is a word that asks you to look back in retrospect and look at conflict, or it's not talking about it as an embodied kind of category in the way that it is stated. I think that the thematic of the forum will have to be located within the processes of design or of response, conflict response, or whatever the thematic is, in order that it belongs both to the practitioner as well as the student. It cannot be something that I require experience for in order to be able to talk about. Otherwise, I will always be in a somewhat how would you say, in a lower position than the person who has experienced it. So it has to be something like, for example, if I'm talking about empathy, it's very difficult to talk about it as somebody having more experience is necessarily more empathetic than a student. So I find that a very interesting word, and to locate thematics in those kind of categories, I think is important. And I think I just leave it there, because sometimes the topic itself privileges certain sections of the panel. So
yes, I think we are having a fantastic discussion. At least I feel so. And maybe this should be transcribed and also shared with the panelists, and they can come up with ideas, and we should make this this wonderful platform an even more sought after platform. Yeah. And I think this is something which we can we can try and do. And everybody who is here has given some very nice ideas. We should look up further from there. Now, I would briefly like to touch, because we have already we are quite ahead in time, and I was asked to manage in about 1.5 hours. So we have about 20 minutes to go. And there may be some other things, some students, some other people who want to talk. So I'll just quickly go to my last question. And my last question is the project the right mode of engaging in a discussion? Or should the forum try some other mode? Like Kashi was saying, that students work through the 5 years. Or somebody said maybe a joint presentation between a practitioner and a student. So could there be other modes rather than the single project as the basis of doing the forum? And especially I look to the students' responses to this, because they have always felt, no, this is the one place where I can show my project, and I want all those people to look at it. And please don't make it a non-jury, because I want a jury. I didn't get a jury when I was, etc. So I also want the students to speak about this. Panelists too. I mean, panelists are not out.
I might offer a few thoughts, and it's almost 2 a.m. in the morning here, so I might unceremoniously exit after that, and I apologize. I will try to stick along on as long as my eyes stay open, but they may droop. So I think that one of the things that I found very liberating and also useful, honest, was the student discussion after Gautam and I had presented during the D talk. And some questions were really about very honest anxieties that students face going into the profession. There are so many women, we almost have an equal ratio. And then as soon as we go into a very different world of practice, the whole dynamic changes very quickly. There are so many issues of politics, ethics, engagement. What do I do next? I need to earn money, but I don't want to work in the rut that is mainstream practice, and so on and so forth. And I think all of these questions can be also part of the more, perhaps a little more formalized as parts of the KVDF forum, which is not to say that there is not student projects. Of course, there should be student projects, but perhaps there are certain themes around ethics, around questions of capitalism, neoliberalism, and even what is going on with patriotism. Things of political engagement, questions of materiality and labor. There's so much to really engage with, and I think that's perhaps some projects could be triggers to have discussions that are much more one of engagement, which I think students seem to be really craving toward.
Thank you, Sarosh. And we'll keep in mind that it's 2 a.m. there. So please feel free whenever you feel too tired. Yeah.
I have something to share that happened during the selection processes. If I can switch the mode for a minute. Initially, the committee, the KVDF team, thought that we should, as panelists or moderators, be involved in the larger selection of the projects. And I think my co-moderators, Shubhra and Riaz, and all of us agreed that we need to step back from that process, and that the KVDF team sifts through all the projects, gets a sense about what is coming in. And I think there have been some fantastic deliberations that happened within the team to go through what really, they thought of value. And I was particularly happy with that process because there was a certain exchange. And that prompts me to also imagine a forum in which the moderators actually, or the panelists, become the second layer or the third layer, while the selection process, the evaluation happens at the level of the forum where the moderators also emerge from the student fraternity or the people who have just graduated maybe. And there can be a very interesting exchange there so that we get a better sense of the cross section of thought and abilities to view this slightly differently. So what I thought, and any of the KVDF team members could add on to this, because I'd like you to sort of elaborate on what I'm saying as was your experience about sifting through 180 projects and what you think is there a potential in that?
I'll just like to add to that. I think yeah, it was a great process when we were supposed to actually the number of projects that came in were also overwhelming, and then we were in a position where we had to step in and sort of understand the major directions that students were coming up and try to narrow down to the projects. And the thing was, from a student perspective, I would like to put it as we were extremely overwhelmed and hesitant at the beginning. The first response when the moderators said that you be involved in it was something hesitant from our side. And uh, I would just like to put this point that what the moderators were also trying to convey to us was that uh, as a student body, we are also very comfortable with the power structure or hierarchy that is created. This was something that came up when the idea of co-panelists was also raised. From a student side, we are very happy to be evaluated, and when you are supposed to evaluate, there comes a sort of responsibility with it and accountability. And what the moderators actually pointed out, and that was a life lesson for us as well, was that as a student body, we have to also take up that accountability if we want that responsibility. That was one thing I would like to add.
Wonderful contribution. I think that's something which we should really keep in mind. But do you think the proceedings of the selection process could be made public? The parameters which all those who are looking at the projects laid out, and kind of normally when there's an architectural competition, the jury is expected to write a jury report. So do you think it's a good idea to have that kind of a report and the 3 or 4 or 5 items of discussion that happen? That might be a very good thing to do. So that,
yes, definitely.
Yeah, so that because it's something which will add to the breadth of discussion that the forum is about. And I think it is also a good record. If we look at several years of the forum, we will start getting an archive of the change in the world and the profession. And I think you'll start getting a very interesting set of remarks. What do you think?
There will be some beeps needed in that one.
Yeah, that of course. I mean, Riaz, that's taken for granted. That,
right.
Yes. Mm.
So, good morning. Firstly, I'd really like to thank the KVD forum, all the panelists, moderators, and everyone. This has been a truly enriching experience. So, from the student's point of view, I have this idea that a student when they are a student is already at a disadvantage, because for us, we're taught that our only tools are drawing. However, a building needs to be truly experienced in space in 3D, and that is possible when you're a practicing architect. But as a student, our whole and soul mode of representation is the drawing, which is why a lot of times throughout school, personally, I feel that we spend too much time drawing, and uh, even appreciation comes in the mode of drawing. The first, when a person sees a project, the first thing that hits you is the strong render, is the colors, is the sharpness of the drawing. But there is sometimes not enough uh, thought given to the idea, to the thought, or to the process, which somehow in the student phase gets lost, because we don't have the ability to go and build out a structure for people to really experience. Because I always feel that structures are best experienced in 3D. So for me personally, I feel that drawings are just a tool. Representation is just a tool. It's what a knife is for a chef. But architecture is the idea, which somehow we as students are at a disadvantage of representing, because we're restricted to a particular medium, and the tangible and the thing which is seen the most is what is appreciated first, instead of probably the idea, which might get lost in the whole process of the presentation. And secondly, sorry.
Sorry. No,
And
please carry on.
And secondly, I also feel that some things are out of the realm of architecture. For example, it's also about client aspiration, about policies. For example, I really don't like the word development control regulation, DCR, that we follow in Mumbai. The word itself is control. We're controlling development. It says things. It has a list of things which we shouldn't do. It has a list of things how to not make space more accessible, how to make the chhajjas not accessible so that people don't encroach it, how to restrict the height of the lofts so that people don't use it. There are so many ways of making space inaccessible, and it does not talk about how do we build or what are the opportunities, but in itself it's restricting. So the vocabulary that we are surrounded by is, again, maybe needs to change for us to look at architecture a little differently, I think.
Rashad, I was just uh, making a very different kind of comment. You talked about the knife and the chef. And if you want to do a certain kind of cuisine, you need a particular kind of knife. And the cutting of the vegetable will bring out the taste in different ways, especially in Chinese cooking. If you don't cut it in the right way, you will not get the taste required. And so the drawing is not a representational tool only. It is a thinking tool. It is a way of entering into the process of carrying something through. And we don't mind if in the forum you come with drawings which are clumsy, as long as they are tools of thought. And I think this is something which all of us, everybody, will be completely sympathetic to, that the drawing is not a showpiece. वो showcase होता है ना घर में, ऐसा नहीं है. हाँ?
I didn't mean it in that way. For me, the tool, or for the chef, the tool is very important. It is a very integral part. But however, and I was not particularly talking about the forum, but I was talking about how we experience architecture through 5 years, is that the the drawing or the final product gets so much more importance, and the idea somehow is not as important, where in reality the idea is equally important. So the drawing, obviously sketching is the first method, and your way of entering and designing and negotiating, and you're trying to think while sketching. But uh, in the process of making drawings, as a jury, 10 minutes, 1 hour probably is not enough time to understand the whole process that I have or a student spends so many months working on. And for a juror, the first thing that they see is probably the drawing or what is tangible. So in that respect, the idea somehow gets lost because of the time constraint and also of uh, our training to strictly focus on drawing first, maybe. So that is where I was coming from.
Yeah.
But Trushad, the other way, the other aspect is also that I disagree, or I would challenge the notion that the only authentic experience of a building is to actually go there. I think what we sense in experiencing a building is sensorial. It's important. But sometimes ascribing all authenticity to that comes at a cost of understanding intangible relationships, as my friend and colleague Kevin Lowe always talks about. And we as architects are trained in the discipline of reading drawings, of reading Google Earth, of cultivating relationships sometimes that get undermined or overwhelmed by a sensorial experience. So it is both that go into, and therefore the discipline of drawing is valid from both points of view, as a thinking tool, but also as a way of excavating relationships that might be buried under the dominance of certain senses. One is not prerogating one over the other, is what I'm trying to say. Therefore, in general, when we read drawings, whether it's student presentations or in other venues, maybe even a plan that you unearth on Google, all of us, including you, have the discipline of reading drawings and exerting our architectural imagination into directions that may not be possible purely by a sensorial. So they're all important. I'd just like to say that.
I have to say too that I sometimes in the last 6 days felt adrift in the current of conversation, but drawings grounded me. When I came to the drawings, this is something I could understand. And there were some beautiful drawings actually, and I did appreciate the students who drew by hand and didn't rely on computer generated images, because these conveyed the thinking process to me much more directly than any talk about what the ideas were. The ideas were in the drawings. I much appreciated that.
I love the last two comments. Also, I think this is a good conversation because it allows us to open up the conversation a little bit more to the question of what constructs a discipline. You know, what constructs a discipline? This is so important because how are we architects, and what is considered the core of a discipline? And I think there are certain things that are perhaps fundamental to what we do: space, drawing, representation, all of that, and then all the other stuff that comes with it. So I think every discipline has to sort of reckon with this, and this shifts. I mean, you know, for a long time, the form was a big question, and I'm kind of happy perhaps that we've not used the word form in the whole for 7 days. I haven't heard the word form. So I think I'm interested in this question of what is disciplinary, what is because only if you have a discipline can you do interdisciplinarity. So I think these are really pertinent questions.
Good. So I think everybody has had some thoughts, and we've been able to take into account most of them. There are two that have come up just now, question and answer. Would also be interesting if panelists present their final year work. Ah, yes, that's a fantastic thing. Those of us who have still kept it can do that. I wouldn't mind doing it.
Sorry, I would fail.
We would all fail. So it's very good that we should do it. And then Kashi is again saying, many questions are intertwined in this question of drawing. Drawings, unfortunately, usually plans are a point of entry into design discussions. But I also get your point. Many times people get seduced by pretty drawings. I often put this out as a challenge that if I redraw a building beautifully, many of us will perceive it that it is a better design. Kashi, I wouldn't agree on I don't think you're skilled enough to take a bad design and draw it beautifully. Though you draw beautifully, but I don't think you you can do that. Not at least with people who are steeped in the notion of reading drawings. And this is a discussion which can go on and on, on and on. It'll never end. So I think I would ask our hosts to round off this thing. I would thank them and I would thank all the students for making our life so rich for the last 8 days.
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
Yeah. And also for making our life difficult. I think Sarosh can well appreciate at 2:30 a.m. in the morning. And but still, it was a wonderful 8 days. And I hope that your next generation of people will keep on doing this as fantastically as you have done. I was telling Tridip the other day that it is one of the finest organized modes of interaction that I have seen in this campus. And he was quite surprised because he didn't think that you could organize that way. But so I'm going to share the YouTube things with him and let them all sort of come to a good realization of the capacity of these students to do things. I really appreciate it. And I thank all the panelists. Being with you all also has been the most wonderful experience. Some of you I did not know very much at all. I mean, Gurmeet I didn't know, except I had seen her work in magazines, but I didn't know her at all. And I didn't know Robert, and I didn't know Gautam Bhan, and I didn't know so many of these people. And it came as a great warm surprise that such human beings also exist on this earth. Thank you very much, all of you. And back to the hosts.
Thank you so much, Professor Chhaya, for your words. And we have been working for many, many, many months, and we did not know that this is how we would be doing the forum. And even though I think the medium of discussion was different, the thoughts and the ideas did not change. And this is sort of reassuring for us because as students, we want this forum to go on for many, many years, and we always worry that we might miss out on it. But this has been the proof that no matter what happens, the critical thinking will not stop and we will keep on going. And we would like to thank all the panelists, all the moderators for making out time for this forum for the busy schedules, especially the ones we contacted in the last minute. And some even changed the schedules for us, even after we confirmed with them. Thank you so much for joining us. But I think the biggest thanks is to the students and the entire team. They have worked tirelessly through their semesters while they were studying. I mean, we went into a pandemic and still it was extremely difficult to work, but at least I think me and Shreya can vouch that we were coordinating with anyone and we faced almost no trouble with the students because everyone was so interested in working. And I think that is the best thing about working with students. I don't have much to add, I think, beyond that, because we are also over time. And thank you to the student panelists who joined us and did not even object to being co-panelists, because usually students have that, like Sharan very rightly added, that accountability that was added onto them, but still I think they rebutted really well. So thank you all for joining us, even on Facebook, on YouTube, and I hope like this thing, because in a way this forum is kind of immortalized because it's always going to be there on YouTube for people to watch and listen. And I think I'm rambling at this point, but thank you all for joining us.
Thank you so much.
And we will meet again next year, hopefully on campus, definitely on campus.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
All the best.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.